Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here. This is going to be a lovely day because we've got some wonderful people who have agreed to be here today to discuss something that's very important. This afternoon, we begin what we hope will be an ongoing intermittent series of conversations with thought leaders on topics devoted to aspects of community, racial and social justice, belonging, and more. Today's conversation will focus on housing and displacement. The purpose of these conversations is to provide some context, framing, and to put some heft behind words that we commonly use, like racial equity, affordable housing, gentrification. Those words, terms can be confusing and muddied without a clear and nuanced understanding of the lived experience and structural roadblocks. Moreover, just as we see homeless people, we need to see the people who live in community roots housing and to recognize that their lives are at the mercy of the intersection of race-based systems and institutions that oppress them. To truly solve for housing instability, we must grapple with some uncomfortable truths and address root causes. This session is a starting place to move us in that direction. Before we start, I want to give you a heads up that I've asked our panelists to go beyond the surface level and dig deeper into this topic. By design, we are not hosting a Q&A session after they speak. Instead, I invite you to listen deeply and take in what you hear. This might seem like a simple ask, but although we hear Black voices, it's a radical act actually to believe what Black voices have to say. We are hosting this conversation until 12:45, maybe a minute or two after, since we started late, at which point we'll say goodbye to our panelists and anyone not scheduled to stay for the Foundation Board meeting following the discussion. The Foundation Board is going to practice putting what they heard into action. For those of you not staying, we invite you to pair up with someone here today. You can use the private chat to ask someone and process what you heard and commit to one action you will take. I think today's panel has a very unique vantage point to take us to a deeper place. Chris Parsons, as you all know, is the president and CEO of Community Roots Housing. His belief in partnerships and in elevating community priorities, I think, sets Community Roots Housing apart from other housing developers. Vivian Phillips, who was raised in Seattle and has lived in the Central District for the past 27 years. Describing all that she has influenced and done for Seattle's civic and cultural life would really require a separate program. Perhaps you listened to the podcast she co-hosts with Marcy Silman called Double Exposure. They plumb the deepest depths and the tiniest cracks of our world to understand how culture and creativity shape our lives. That question might include, what does culture say about our communities? Or maybe you know Vivian is the founder of Art Noir, which is located at Midtown Square. It will be the Central District's preeminent Black arts and culture space. Barrett McCauley has described herself as a transcultural, transdisciplinary, transnational artist, curator, photographer, and writer. She is the curatorial fellow at On the Boards and the founder of Black Cinema Collective. I want to begin this conversation with a frame. It's the first sentence from a novel by Toni Morrison called Sula. In that place where they tore the nightshade and blackberry patches from their roots, to make way for the Medallion City Golf Course. There was once a neighborhood. That one sentence could apply to just about every BBI, Black, Brown, Indigenous community in this country. Chris, tell us about Rise Together and your thinking about the necessity of a Rise Together collective.
Thank you, Eric, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy, Eric, that you're spearheading these the series of conversations, and honored to be on a panel with Vivian and Barrett. Barrett, we haven't met yet, but it's a great to meet you. So real quick background, Rise Together is a capital campaign designed to raise a lot of money, $40 million, to help build out the community service space on the ground floor of several projects where we are the lead developer. And I want to put the word lead in brackets, because I'm going to come back to that word quite a bit in the next couple of minutes. In all of our projects, we're partnering with community groups who are substantially smaller and less well-resourced than us. They are BIPOC and LGBTQ led in all cases but one. And the campaign includes some really familiar projects: Liberty Bank Building, Africatown Plaza, Pride Place, the White Center Hub, Bird Bar Place, and a few more. I am clearly leaving out a lot of detail of the campaign because that's not the point of my remarks in this conversation this morning. The point is, why are we entering into these deep partnerships, and how do we partner and aspire to partner? Because it's always an aspiration. We can't work in community and work in deep partnerships and lead after we have, to requote Toni Morrison, after we have uprooted the nightshade and the blackberry. We can't go striding into communities like the heroes with the answers. Our role is to get out of the way so that our partners can lead. They don't need us to lead. They may need our balance sheet, but they don't need us to lead. And it's important to be clear in our language. We're not letting our partners lead. That language in and of itself perpetuates white supremacy. We have to get out of their way. They don't need us. They need us to stand down. And again, what they need is to be able to leverage our balance sheet and sometimes our real estate development expertise. When we come to fully understand that we have a big balance sheet because of the racist housing and financing systems that we work in, then we can see that this is really our imperative, that these true partnerships where we don't lead and where we acknowledge this racist system that is at the root of our work. And when I talk about that, I'm not saying that we're out there actively being racist, but their work is and has benefited from a system that is actively racist. The investors, the lenders, the public funders favor us because we're a white-led organization. And this isn't some academic perspective. This isn't something that I'm making up. Eric asked us to go deep, so I'm going deep. I have witnessed with my own eyes organizations not getting support from lenders and investors. I have seen public funders with my own eyes give us funding to support a building that we were managing that was struggling, while refusing to do the same thing for the Black-run organization who actually owned that property. Our balance sheet derives from a racist system that favored us because the white lenders and investors and public servants believe that the Black, the Indigenous, the Latino, the Asian organizations could not. It's the very definition of white supremacy. So when you think about our partnerships and what we're doing in this clearer light of what's at the root of the problem, then you can see that, you know, we're not giving back. Hey, let's give back to the community. Let's help these little organizations. That's not what we're doing. We're on, and we need to be on our hands and knees, working in the ground, replanting the blackberries and nightshade alongside our partners and under the direction of our partners. This is our imperative to reverse this inequity, and an inequity that we ourselves are a part of and complicit in. So that's the answer to the first question, Eric, is what's the vision behind our partnerships? The answer to the second question, how do these partnerships move us to transformative change? So my question, because I got these questions in advance, thank you. My question was, who's the us? And there are a couple of us's. Let's take the easy one. Let's take community, 23rd and Union. The transformation that's happened, the change taking place there is nothing short of remarkable. And as a staff person of Community Roots Housing, I'm honored to be a part of that transportation. And as an organization, we're honored to be a part of that transportation. But let us never say that we caused the transformation that has occurred there. Let us say that when organizations like Community Roots Housing enter true partnerships with organizations like Africatown Community Land Trust and Bird Bar Place, then great transformation is possible, and reversing the inequity of the past is possible. So that's the easy us to get to. The harder us facing transformative change is the Community Roots Housing us. And you're witnessing, board members and staff members on this call, and Vivian and Barrett, you get to see into this a little bit. You're witnessing the transformation of Community Roots Housing in this moment. This act of getting out of the way so that our community partners can lead. As we're in the process of debating the evolution of our core purpose, this change really started 12 years ago when we stopped saying, hey, we're about building housing and we're about building community. And that really got us to refocus. And that's really what has led us to these deep partnerships and to rise together. But now we're going in even deeper and asking ourselves, you know, how we really build community and why we're even in this position in the first place. Why is it that community even needs to be rebuilt? And it's because of the inequity, and it's because of the racist inequity of the past. So our transformation is moving us to see that we're on a mission to reverse this inequity in ourselves, in the communities where we serve, in the communities where we have been responsible for this very inequity, and never alone, but always in deep partnership. That's our imperative, and that's our organization organization's transformation.
Thank you, Chris. That's a monumental beginning for this conversation. Vivian, you've lived in the Central District a long while, and you have been a witness to gentrification, a witness to the dispersal of Black people from the Central District. What are we, the public, not seeing? What do we not, what have we missed? And what do you see as some hidden truths?
Yeah, it's an interesting to me to listen to Chris too. And even though Chris and I have had some contentious moments in the past, I do believe that the desire that Community Roots Housing has to really be a facilitator of change and growth and new development. I will say that one of the things that I think we have missed is that the central area specifically was a place that people migrated to, right? And I think we missed the fact that people migrated out of the central area and new migration happened. I also feel like we missed the recognition of that fact and what that would mean to the community. As it relates specifically to Community Roots Housing, I was thinking about the fact that I missed that the Central Area Development Association would no longer exist because the support base changed so dramatically in the central area, which is where Community Roots Housing came in, right? I think that one of the things going forward that I hope we do not miss is the fact that there should be a time when there is no longer a need for Community Roots Housing to be the facilitator. That Community Roots Housing plays a role in shifting the narrative about the capacity of the communities that they support and serve. So I'm looking forward, I think, and not wanting to miss too many more marks. But I think we missed so many changes that were evolving, that were destined to happen, but we didn't really take them into true account. You know, I am the product of a family. My mother lived in the very same house for 50 years in the central area. The only house my family ever purchased. And we missed the fact that property rates would change, that new residency, new development would shift the wealth base in the central area. We missed that whole process of eminent domain that accompanied the drug activity in the central area. We missed that Weed and Seed was going to weed out members of the Black community and make a place for new people to come in. We missed the impacts of the I-90 upgrades that took out a whole swath of homes owned by Black people, but they never went back to that community because people had to find other places to live, and it wasn't in the central area. Right? And I think we miss that, and we have missed, and we will continue to miss, that racism is not an emotional state. Racism is systemic, and systems are built on racist policies. And until we undo racist policies, we will continue to see damage done to communities that have no power over systems of any kind. So every time I hear the word racism kind of come up, I'm like, are we talking about being racist, or are we talking about being prejudiced? And I think we get into these conversations so often and just throw around words that we don't really understand the meaning of, nor do we understand the impact of those meanings on humans, on real people. Capitalism has overshadowed humanity in the central area. That I can say, because I don't feel like anyone has ever taken into account, for instance, the effect that it would have on me to have a building that's 4 stories high behind me. I no longer get sunshine. Do you see what I'm saying? It's those kinds of impacts. And I think that we once were a city that really cared about neighborhoods and the people in neighborhoods. There were neighborhood service centers all over, but now we don't even have any of that, right? There's no neighborhood cohesion. Everyone is an individual in a space. And so we can do placemaking and, you know, cultural activities all day long, but if we're not changing how people regard one another, then I don't think we're actually changing very much. And I'm going to stop there.
Preach. I'm gonna come back to something you said, but I have to ask Barrett a question first. Barrett, you once wrote, "People collect dolls and coins. I collect memories." And I also know that you keep receipts. So tell us about cultural erasure and the traumatic violence of gentrification and this project you're curating for On the Boards. How can we begin to learn from and apply your work?
Thank you so much, Eric, for inviting me here, and Chris for that introduction to community roots housing that I'm still learning much about, and Vivian, always for the wisdom and history and the receipts you hold, my word. That's a very big question that has a lot of parts in there, so there's no way I'm going to be able to answer all of it in my first go round. But I do feel like starting with, I'm not from Seattle originally. I feel like it's very important to say that up front. I moved here 6 years ago. I don't even live in Seattle. I live in Everett, north of, and I commute into work, right? I'm an immigrant in this country for all of the historical, colonial, white supremacist reasons that that shape the world that we're living in, and therefore right down to the dangerous and violent microcosms of gentrification in neighborhoods that we're talking about. I lived in New York for 17 years before moving here, and walking the streets of New York and having a pedestrian relationship with an urban space taught me everything about how gentrification operates from one neighborhood to the next, living in several different neighborhoods there. And so cultural erasure for me has to do with being separated from the place where your memories reside, where your memories were formed, where your sense of self and your identity is formed. When developers come into a space after city governments have neglected a space, because this is the order that I've watched. I'm not an urban development professional, I'm an artist, right? And a person who dwells in spaces. So my purview is just at the street level, living my life. I lived on the Lower East Side in New York. That is historically an immigrant neighborhood, right? Multiple immigrants living together. And it was a poor part of New York and a neglected part of New York that started to fall apart. It's known as Alphabet City back in the 80s, before I moved there. I'm not that old. And because it was neglected by city government, the buildings fell apart. They began to provide shelter for people who didn't have homes, for people who were selling drugs, for people who were turning tricks to make a living. The community took it under their own charge to fix up the place, clean up those buildings themselves, pool their own resources. When buildings were demolished, they put in community gardens. By the time I lived there, there were over 50 community gardens made by the neighborhood, right? The area started to look cute. The artists came in. Some of the buildings that were fixed up were affordable for artists, right? The artists can live there, make their work, live among immigrants. Queer folks come in, right? Because they can't live anywhere else. They've been pushed out of their homes. New culture forms around this, bridging with the historical cultures. These are the receipts we're talking about. This is not a unique story. This is a story that repeats in cities all over the world, in multiple cultures and languages. Queer community, artist communities, immigrant communities. It looks cute, so the yuppies move in. The college students that have a bit of extra money move in. Music movements and new little art galleries and little restaurants form. Developers on the down low start walking around and checking the place out. Looks like an up and coming place worthy of investment. The city realizes how much it's worth and decides, oh, maybe we should go back and reclaim some of these spaces that we actually own, that we weren't caring about. Sell to developers, the developers come in, you walk into that neighborhood now, it doesn't look anything like what it looked like in the early 2000s when I lived there. And all of the people who lived there and built that culture are gone. Now, I have scant memories compared to the people who were living there in the 70s and 80s, but I know that when I go back there, my memories are gone. My memories are gone of working in art studios there. Those art studios are gone, of showing in those small spaces or doing theater readings in small little apartments or abandoned spaces because we didn't have to pay to use those spaces. All of the work and documentation is gone. What does that mean? The people who got married, who had their children there, who raised families there, they can't show the proof of their stories. And so those stories don't live and they die. And then we hope that someone will write about it. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. What does this do to a community? What does this do and ripple out into society? This is what my concern is with the project that I'm working on now. Because I bring those receipts into this new place that I'm living in. And my context of being a commuter into Seattle is that I get to see from a distance what the city looks like every time I drive into it. I see how the skyline has changed just in the 5 years that I've been here. It is not the same skyline I used to drive towards 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And what I understand when I speak to people like Vivian is that this city used to be friendlier, more interconnected than what I've experienced. I've experienced the freeze. I've experienced a lack of memory. I've experienced difficulty finding communities, for it to be obvious to find where to find my people. It took me 3.5 years to find where the Black people were. It wasn't easy because they were scattered. Because the same thing that happened in the Lower East Side happened to the Central District, right? Happened here in Everett too. Happened all over, where a person like me could move into Seattle or move into Washington and not know where to find people who have similar cultures to me, who are immigrants as well, who are Black folks as well, who are queer folks as well. The danger of this is that this creates a disparate society that cannot encourage people to care for each other the way Vivian just spoke of. If we're trying to work on relationships where communities are at the center of how generational wealth is used to repatriate back to these communities that don't have that money to decide on how their histories, their stories, their cultures, and their memories are preserved, the way Chris spoke about in his introduction, then you don't have a society. And you certainly don't have one where people are connected, right? And so that's, Nina Simone said an artist's duty is to reflect the times. An artist's duty is to reflect the times. I don't work in policy. I work in the arts, and arts is part of the culture and a very important part of the culture that seeks always to bring people together and bring people together to make them a little uncomfortable, to think together, to feel together, to have a little more empathy about something that they may not have an everyday experience with. And so if I go into the project of what I'm working on, it is a immersive multi-site specific project, working with a theater company that is out of New York and also with artists here in the city to create a ritual-based immersive experience with site partners, specifically Wanawari, which is an art house of community belonging in Central District that is run by Elishaba Johnson, and Inye Wakoma, in a house that is a 4-generation house of Inye Wakoma's family that they have managed to hold on to in the Central District. And they are using this house to speak to these issues, but also to celebrate Black histories and Black life and retain those memories that have been lost by the 70+% of Black families that have been ousted from that neighborhood. The other site partner is Inscape, which is a former detention center and immigration processing center in the in the International District that has deep and difficult histories that affected African immigrants, AAPI immigrants, that held Japanese people, interned Japanese people after the Second World War. And these sites will be where this theatrical engagement will occur. And what my collaborator, Tom Pearson of Third Reel Projects, and I are trying to shape is a reckoning for any participating audience member who walks through these spaces with us and engages the performing artists in intimate engagements about the histories of these spaces, is to locate themselves on the spectrum of gentrification. Because gentrification has a spectrum, and that's the hard part of this conversation. It's not black and white where there's one enemy here and then there's all the people who are being affected. Where are you on this line? Have you moved into a neighborhood because it was hot now and you could get like some easy rent? And then you know you're holding onto an apartment that somebody who makes less than you really should have rights to hold instead of you, right? There are all sorts of different ways. I'm gonna stop now so that we can go into other nuances, but we're trying to ask these questions of how have you participated in this on an intimate level? And to think about how your everyday contributes to this and how you can shift that. I'll pause there.
Barrett, now you remember what I said, I have to have paper and pen when you start talking. Let's let that soak in. I'm gonna go back to something Vivian said that really involved capitalism, but also racist policy. And that's specifically why I didn't want any policymakers here. Because there's one thing that policy cannot do. Well, there's several things, but one is it can't respond to the current moment. It can't heal, and it never reaches the community in the ways that it thinks it does or claims to. But what Barrett said was really all about how culture and arts is policy. If we replaced the word gentrification with the word progress, and we think about racist policies like redlining, restrictive covenants, lending discrimination, all these things have kept certain people in certain spaces or out of certain spaces. Does progress on this continuum of gentrification, does that mean that this will always be the case, that we have to marginalize and erase BBI communities and histories? Is that the only way it can work? How are we going to change that?
Well, I think we have to be honest, and I will say that my initial understanding of the word gentrification is not at all what we are saying it is today. Gentrification, in my original understanding, is a process where people leave a community and they return to it. Right? They are coming back into a community with more education, with more money, with more access to power, those kinds of things. But it's now, another term for urban removal. Not renewal, but urban renewal, right? And removal. And I think we should just call it what it is. It's urban removal. And policy uses nuanced terms that lay people don't pick up on, right? So I'm reminded of the comp plan, and I'm reminded of going to meetings where community is invited to come and review the comp plan, the comprehensive plan for the city of Seattle. And when is the meeting held? At noon on a Wednesday? Who's coming? Okay, who's coming to that meeting? And I went to one of those meetings when both my mother and brother resided in the community, and I was on fire. Why were you not at this meeting, right? We were at work, we couldn't go. So those are the nuances that policy uses, right? The nuance of urban villages. Boy, that sounded so beautiful 20 years ago or 25 years ago, I think, when that concept was first introduced during the Rice administration, if I recall correctly. And that said, oh, we're gonna get service now, right? We're gonna actually get stoplights on streets where kids have to cross the street. We're gonna get streets that are fixed. That means we're gonna have, big box stores that don't sell second-rate products to us. Well, that's not exactly what happened. We got urban removal in order for the urban villages to take hold in the community. And now we have services that are provided that Black people would have loved to have access to, right? But we don't, because we don't live in the community that is now an urban village. We're gone. So it is a game. It's a game, it's a chess game, and it's about where is your attention going to be focused. But we keep your attention focused on something else because you got to worry about property taxes. You have to worry about policing. You have to worry about safety. You have to worry about, food and food deserts. So there are all of these other things over here that have your attention when the real happening is on the other side, and you are not invited necessarily to that conversation.
Never invited. Well, okay, I was not invited. What?
Totally uninvited by having it at noon on Wednesday.
Noon, that's so policy, right? That's just so typical of policy making. What is there a role, how does gender fit into all of this?
Say more.
Well, women, how have women been impacted really by this dispersal? Single mothers, working women who now live wherever, but it's not close to childcare, it's not close to jobs, it's not close to family, it's not close to all of the circles that provide emotional support, church.
Yeah, if I may, I think that women have always been the caretakers of community in one way or another. And that is not ethnically specific. That is, kind of the nature of nurture. And so I think that has been the case. However, I will say racist systems have pitted Black women against Black men. When your community has been a mining place for mass incarceration, when you have generations of young Black males in prison, then the community is left to women, right? So there's that part too. When you are taking property away from grandma because grandson was caught on the corner with a dime bag, and policy, a 3 strikes out policy, then relates back to wherever that particular person lived. And that was at grandma's house. So now grandma cannot, she's not only not able to pay the property taxes in a dwelling that is in misrepair, but the property underneath the dwelling continues to skyrocket. You lose that, right? Then you can go purchase a piece of property for taxes at auction, but you have to have all cash to do it. So it's this vicious cycle that, keeps us on the treadmill, we're just constantly running from one thing to another thing to try to keep up. And you can't look in all directions because no one is caring for the women either.
I'd like to add to that too, because there's another effect of gentrification and displacement from all this rapid capitalist development that affects a group of people that don't often get talked about or included, which is queer communities, and more removed from that, trans communities and trans Black communities and trans Black women, who are the unsafest group, the least secure group of human beings in the world, but certainly in this country. Queer folks already have housing insecurity from jump because of all sorts of other societal structures that say that they are not valued because of their sexual preferences or because of their gender identities. And so they lose homes or spaces with their families or their first families or their blood nuclear families, and have to form families for their own security and safety. And they also fall into the net that Vivian is talking about, where if they've been fortunate enough to form a house with a house mother in a low-income neighborhood that is undergoing the violence of gentrification, they have even less wherewithal for where to go and resettle. And they make up a large number of people who end up living on the streets because they have even less options. And they have, speaking of policy, less services that are even established within city governments to help them to get food, to get medical care, to get vouchers for anything. When we talk about the ripple effect of how this is affecting different communities, I always feel the need to bring the trans and queer community into it, because this is a group of people that we're not even looking at.
I've been trying to recall when it was that, or I guess it's, but it's a process of creating unsafe community for queer people. And I mean, I grew up with Miss Willie. You know what I mean? It was like, there was no big
Everybody
deal.
lived in the same, everybody lived in the
not
neighborhood.
It was, they were in the family, raised around the corner. If I wanted, some particular kind of advice, I knew where to go. And now it's just completely and totally unsafe. And it makes me sad.
Yeah.
Well, when you collectively put together everything that all of you have said, it makes me think about how our society is shaping urban space. And so community, on the one hand, is not just a place, right? It's like an activity. There has to be something that creates community building to occur. I mean, as Barrett was saying, people aren't going to come together and automatically you're going to have a community. I mean, how do we look at community now? Is it even possible to have it when we think about how urban space is shaped by power, by race, and by space? Because some people are not wanted in certain spaces. That's just an honest. That space could be a park.
I mean, there's also how are we, and I don't know the answer to this. So this is somewhat a statement, somewhat a question of how does policy, or how do financially well-heeled organizations create space that is accessible. And by that, I mean that people who are dispersed, communities that have already been dispersed because of gentrification, can learn about, so that they can gather in a new space to figure out how to build new cultural bridges around the circumstances that we find ourselves in now, because the dispersion has happened. And so now there is a trying to bring back together, where we're speaking about how do we attend to a kind of return, right? Which is what I see happening in Central District with the new Black cultural corridor that is forming, of which Wanawari is a part and Art Noir is a part, right? But if we listen to the question or the call that Chris put out at the beginning of how do you get out of the way, how do organizations, white-led organizations, get out of the way, understanding that leveraging that generational wealth that was gained by white supremacist slavery economies, right? And returning that to a community in a way that is publicly and openly accessible, because that's part of the game, is to create these structures of aid and saviorism that are not accessible because people don't know about it and don't know where to go and don't know where to find each other after this dispersion has happened. That's what I see, at least that's what I feel I've witnessed coming here, is as a Black immigrant person, I did not know where to go and find other Caribbean people or other African people or Black people. And that felt very much like it was by design. And if I didn't have, I have the resources to go on Google and search up a couple of things. I have a life that has taught me how to find cultural spaces. But what if you're not a person who has those resources?
Yeah.
Or that know-how to do that kind of research, right? And even when I did that research, it was still very difficult. It took 3 years. I had to go back to school to find an entryway, to be honest. Mm-hmm. What if you don't have that option? Then you're marooned where you are. Yeah. So when you ask that question of, even if it's to gather in a park or in a place of worship, or at a food market or what have you, how do organizations like, community housing, like community roots housing, how are you creating that in a way that is publicly, openly accessible? How do you get that information out on a social level, on a marketing level, on a policy level? so that you can center the communities that Chris, you're asking, how do we center those communities? You see?
I just have, because I know we're over time.
We have
Yeah.
minutes, yes.
And I just one thing that's been on my mind, you know, we talk a lot about generational wealth and the disappearance of that or the absence of that. And I think often we feel like there's a magic formula that's going to somehow instantly provide the opportunity for people to have generational wealth. What I would prefer is that if people would think about it a little bit differently, and that would be to take the wealth, the investments that you hold on to, and look at them as reparative wealth distribution opportunities. If we are talking about setting, you have to have a foundation, right? In order to then build from that foundation. And I have appealed to individuals who have supported Art Noir to see that as a reparative wealth generating opportunity, which means redistribute your wealth. You want to get rid of some of that money that you have that you know you didn't earn? I will take it and we will put it to good use. Do you hear what I'm saying? And so it's not, it doesn't have to be a building, it doesn't have to be a structure, it doesn't have to be a piece of art. It can be confidence in the ability to actually financially support a culture.
Vivian?
Bye.
I gave you the last word, because let's all think about what you just said. Let that soak in for a minute.